Welcome to the Rutledge Perspective. I'm your host, Laurel Rutledge, and this show is where we talk about things that are top of mind as you navigate your career or build your business. The plan is to get you out of your rut or talk you back off that ledge with insights and perspectives on the daily grind. Here, we speak the truth. Here, we challenge ideas. Here, we give ourselves grace. And along the way, we also have a little fun. Welcome to the village. Welcome to this week's episode of the Rutledge Perspective. And we're going to be talking about clarity and expectations and communications this week. And we've talked about some of that stuff before, but there was a question I received over the weekend and a couple of conversations I had that made me think, this is probably a good topic to cover again. So I was honored to be able to speak at the South Bay Women's Conference over the weekend. And it was a hybrid conference. So there were some people that were there in person, socially distanced, masked up, all that kind of stuff, and a lot of people that were online. And so it was the first time I've gotten a chance to speak at a conference like that in a long time. And so I really enjoyed doing that and was just so honored to be a part of that. And my topic was, there are still opportunities out there, even in the midst of this craziness, if you're willing to seize them. Now, I'm not sure I actually covered that topic, but what we did talk about was leadership and clarity and all of the things you need to do and managing expectations and getting really, really clear. Because if you're not clear and you don't have a plan, then how do you know where you're going to go? And even as I talk to people all the time about seizing opportunities, it's really about understanding who you are, where you are, what you want, and what you need to do to get there. And so as I had this conversation and gave this speech and everyone was so engaged and it was so exciting, I'm so appreciative of that. I had a question at the end, and that question was about expectations, because one of the things I talked about was it is really important that as you look at putting team on, or you look at who you're going to hire, or you look at even how you're setting goals and expectations, or setting goals and plans, that you really are clear about your expectations, especially when you're talking about hiring people. And so the question was, I'm this type A, right? I'm an entrepreneur. And so I know there are things that I expect people to be able to do. There's a level of performance. There's a level of contribution that I really expect. And I'm clear about that when I hire people. And yet I've been disappointed when they get on board that they're just not able to do what I expect them to do. And it was a fantastic question, right? Because that's a lot of us. A lot of us think we're clear. A lot of us are really, really focused on getting stuff done and high quality and making it happen. And we know exactly what we want. But here's the thing. Communication is key. So if someone is not meeting our expectations, the first thing as leaders we need to look at is, did we really communicate them clearly? And more importantly, especially if you're an entrepreneur and you are in that pain point, right? You got to get somebody on because there's just too much to do and you need some help with things. Often we get so caught up in the interview process of finding someone to alleviate the pain, or we fall in love with that candidate that was there because they're just a really cool person and we like them and we enjoy talking to them, that we are not taking the time to really examine and listen to what they're telling us. We ask questions, they give us answers. We ask the next question as we're doing this interview, but are we really listening to the answers that people are giving us? Because the answers should actually form some of your next questions. And the answers people give you will give you great insight into their true capability, how much they're brought in, how much additional training or support they're going to need. It will tell you a lot when you're interviewing somebody if you really listen to the answers that they give you to your questions. And when you talk about expectations, some of the questions that you ask should incorporate the expectations that you have for the role or for the person coming in or what have you. So often when we think about how something has failed in a relationship, a business relationship, or even a personal relationship, it generally comes down to communication and expectations. Have we been really clear? Or do we just think we've been clear? Are we listening to reply, or are we listening to understand so that we can then form a reply that makes sense and gets to the crux of the issue? Are we so frustrated that we're no longer communicating to get a point across or to get a message across, but we're potentially communicating because we're just irritated and we're angry and we're lashing out to hurt the other person? And we may be doing it in a passive aggressive manner, right? But as I've said, just because you smile when you say something ugly doesn't mean it's not ugly. And so thinking about how we communicate and the things we want and who we want to help us and how we bring people into our village and onto our teams, it's imperative as leaders that we communicate our expectations very clearly. And in order to do that, we've got to be clear about what our expectations are. We've got to be clear about who we are. We've got to be clear about how much time we're willing to spend to train someone. We've got to be clear about what we have in place that gets people able to be on board quickly. We've got to be clear about our tools and our tricks of the trade and our gaps. We've got to be clear about all of that stuff and willing to communicate it so that people don't come on board and they're surprised. I remember when I was hiring team, we had carved out the company and I was putting on a bunch of team, going from 15 to about 50. And every time I had a conversation, I said, okay, so let me tell you a little bit about where we are and what we're doing and what we're building, because it is really important for you to be clear about what you're getting and what you're stepping into before you make a decision to join. And then I laid out where we were. And I wasn't ugly. I wasn't a naysayer because I was in it to win it. But I was also really candid about we are building. We are just getting team. We are having to clean out processes. We are carving out from a 150-year-old company. We are new, but we're an 80-year-old startup. So there's stuff in the mix that we got to think about. All of this kind of stuff I talked about with potential candidates so they knew the landscape they were walking into. And I was also really clear about me as a leader and what my expectations were and how I like to lead and how I like to manage and what my strengths were, but also what my challenges were. I didn't want anyone to come in and say they were surprised because that begins to erode trust. You didn't tell me. How come I didn't know? Now, it's one thing if people just don't get it, right? And they're not listening. But I wanted to make sure I laid out everything so no one could say that I held things back from them. It's the same thing when you are building your business or when you are starting or building a relationship, when you're getting that foundation set of trust and reliability and respect. Being clear, communicating often, communicating well. Sometimes that communication is just being silent and listening, being willing to understand both what is said and what is not said. Listening actively, which means you're listening to people's words, but you're also watching body language. You're listening to tone. You're listening to facial expressions. All of that goes to serve as your ability as a great leader, a servant leader, to put in place teams and processes and communication that is clear and direct and aligned with the vision and the values that you had, and puts in place an opportunity for people to align with you, to follow you, to support your mission, to be clear on what your expectations are so that you're not disappointed. Because most of the times when something gets misaligned is because there is a disconnect in understanding around expectations. The performance didn't meet expectations because maybe the expectations weren't clearly communicated, or the expectations that were set were just unreasonable for the person that was hired. They just don't have the capability or the desire to do what the real expectations are. You know, for those of us who move really quickly, we often have these expectations and we're really clear in our mind, but are we actually saying it out loud? I have a good friend I've known for 35 years and we laugh all the time because we'll start talking and often he'll start in the middle of a conversation. I'm like, well, wait, I missed something. I need you to back up because you started somewhere in the middle. And he'll just start laughing and say, well, yeah, see, that was the conversation I had with me, myself, and I in my head, right? And I do the same thing. I've had this whole scenario planned out with me. And then when I communicate or start talking to someone else, I'm starting way down the road and they've missed the whole first part of the story that got to why we are even at that part of the road. So this week, think very clearly and be mindful of how you're setting expectations and how you're being clear. How you're being clear about your needs and your wants, your desires, the things that make your soul sing, the things that make you happy, the things that make you sad, the things that hurt you. Be clear around how you expect your team to come together, how you expect them to perform, how you expect them to communicate with you around things that are going on in the business. And get really, really mindful around listening actively. Listen to understand the people that are talking to you. Listen to understand the people that are trying to communicate with you and to give you information. Because if you don't do that, or if you're cutting people off, if you're not paying attention, what you will find is that those who you're relying on to give you information will stop talking. Or they'll just tell you what you want to hear because your behavior has said you don't want to hear what they have to say, or you're not willing to communicate clearly, or you really don't want their perspective. And if that's not what you mean, then you really want to take time to be mindful and to be present in how and when you're communicating with people on your team and what that communication is like and what the content is like, so that if expectations are unmet, you really can then have that conversation around, okay, let's get clear. Let's make sure we're all on the same page so we can move forward in a way that makes some sense. And that's the Rutledge Perspective for this week. I, again, am just so excited. South Bay Women's Conference this year. It was a fantastic event. For those of you who have never been, I really highly recommend that you check it out. I hope next year that it'll actually be able to be back to being a really big, really fantastic event for everybody to show up in person. Thanks so much for tuning in. I will catch you next time. You have been listening to the Rutledge Perspective podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If we've given you a new perspective or helped you clarify your own, please leave us a review, send us your comments, give us a 5-star rating. We take that information seriously, and it helps us to decide what our next episodes will be. Now, you can find more information about this and other episodes of the show on laurelrutledge.com. And you can subscribe to the show wherever you get your favorite podcasts. You can also follow me on social media. And if there's someone that you think would enjoy or benefit from the Rutledge Perspective podcast, please pass it along.